Daniel wasn't looking for love when he joined the online gaming community. He was just a 22-year-old college student trying to escape the stress of his final semester, losing himself in virtual worlds where his biggest worry was whether his character had enough health potions for the next boss fight. The gaming forum had become his sanctuary, a place where he could discuss strategy, share achievements, and connect with people who understood his passion for intricate storylines and complex gameplay mechanics. That's where he first encountered someone with the username Alexander Knight. At first, it was just casual conversation in the game chat. Alexander had an impressive knowledge of classic RPGs and seemed to share Daniel's appreciation for games that prioritized narrative depth over flashy graphics. Their discussions about character development and plot twists gradually evolved into private messages, and Daniel found himself looking forward to logging in each evening just to see if Alexander was online. Alexander was articulate and thoughtful in a way that stood out from the typical gaming community banter. He wrote in complete sentences, asked meaningful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in Daniel's opinions about everything from game design to philosophy. When Daniel mentioned he was studying literature, Alexander revealed that he was also passionate about books, particularly classic novels that explored themes of identity and social class. They spent hours discussing authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Charles Dickens, analyzing how literary characters navigated the complexities of wealth, status, and personal authenticity. As their friendship deepened, Alexander began sharing more personal details about his life. He described feeling trapped by family expectations, struggling to find his own identity while being constantly reminded of the path others had chosen for him. He talked about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw his potential utility rather than his actual personality. Daniel found these confessions deeply moving, recognizing his own struggles with self-doubt and the pressure to meet other people's expectations. Alexander painted a picture of himself as someone caught between two worlds. He had access to opportunities that most people could only dream of, but those opportunities came with strings attached that sometimes felt more like chains. He spoke about wanting to pursue his own interests and make his own choices, but being constantly pulled back into obligations and responsibilities that had been decided for him before he was old enough to have a voice in the matter. Daniel felt a deep connection to these struggles, even though his own challenges came from the opposite direction. While Alexander felt constrained by too many options and expectations, Daniel often felt limited by too few resources and opportunities. But both of them seemed to share a longing for authentic connection and the freedom to be themselves without judgment or pressure to conform to external expectations. Their conversations gradually became more intimate and personal. Alexander shared stories about feeling isolated despite being constantly surrounded by people, about struggling to distinguish between genuine friendship and people who were attracted to his circumstances rather than his personality. Daniel opened up about his own insecurities, his fear that he wasn't interesting or accomplished enough to deserve real love, his worry that he would never find someone who appreciated him for who he actually was rather than who he might become. 3 months into their friendship, Daniel realized that his feelings had evolved beyond casual companionship. He found himself thinking about Alexander throughout the day, wondering what he was doing, imagining what it would be like to meet him in person. Their late-night conversations had become the highlight of his week, and he felt more understood and appreciated than he had in any of his previous relationships. Alexander seemed to be experiencing similar feelings. His messages became more affectionate, more focused on Daniel personally rather than their shared interests. He started asking about Daniel's day, remembering details from previous conversations, and expressing genuine concern when Daniel mentioned stress about exams or family issues. There was a tenderness in his communication that suggested deeper emotional investment. When Alexander finally suggested that they might be developing romantic feelings for each other, Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that he hadn't experienced since his first crush in high school. They spent several weeks discussing what this might mean for their relationship, both acknowledging that the distance between them made things complicated, but neither wanting to ignore the genuine connection they had developed. Alexander mentioned that he lived several states away, which explained why they had never encountered each other in person despite sharing so many interests and perspectives. He described his location in vague terms, mentioning a large city with good universities and cultural opportunities, but never getting specific about exactly where he was or what he was doing there. Daniel assumed this was just natural caution about sharing personal information with someone he had only met online. As their relationship became more explicitly romantic, they began talking about the possibility of meeting in person. Alexander seemed enthusiastic but cautious, mentioning that his family situation was complicated and that he would need to find the right time when he could travel without creating problems for himself. Daniel offered to visit Alexander instead, but Alexander insisted that it would be easier for him to travel to Daniel's city when the timing was right. The conversations about meeting in person inevitably led to discussions about physical attraction and appearance. Both of them acknowledged that they had developed strong emotional and intellectual connections without knowing what the other person looked like, and both expressed some nervousness about whether that connection would translate to physical chemistry. Daniel had always been somewhat insecure about his appearance, and Alexander seemed to share similar concerns. After several weeks of dancing around the topic, Daniel finally suggested that they exchange photos. He explained that he wasn't particularly concerned about whether Alexander looked like a movie star, but that he felt like seeing each other's faces would help him feel more connected and make their relationship feel more real. Alexander agreed, but asked for a few days to find a good photo that actually represented how he looked in person, rather than just sending a random selfie. Daniel spent considerable time selecting his own photo, finally settling on a casual picture that his roommate had taken of him studying in the campus coffee shop. It wasn't his most flattering angle, but it felt authentic and representative of who he was in his daily life. He sent it to Alexander along with a message explaining that he was nervous about sharing it, but excited to finally put a face to the person who had become so important to him. Alexander's response was everything Daniel had hoped for. He complimented Daniel's appearance, but focused more on how the photo captured Daniel's thoughtful personality and kind expression. He said that seeing Daniel's face made their connection feel even more real and meaningful, and that he was even more excited about the possibility of meeting in person. He promised to send his own photo within the next day or two, once he found one that he felt good about sharing. Daniel spent the next 48 hours in a state of excited anticipation. He found himself imagining what Alexander might look like, wondering if his appearance would match the mental image that Daniel had constructed based on their conversations. He hoped that Alexander would be attractive, but he was more concerned about whether Alexander's photo would capture the intelligence and warmth that had drawn Daniel to him in the first place. When Alexander's message finally arrived with a photo attachment, Daniel's heart was racing as he opened it. He had prepared himself for various possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for what he actually saw when the image loaded on his screen. Chapter 2: The Shocking Revelation. The photo that appeared on Daniel's screen was professional quality, clearly taken by someone who knew how to work with lighting and angles. It showed a young man who was undeniably handsome, with the kind of classical features that belonged in a magazine or advertising campaign. The subject had perfectly styled dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and a confident smile that suggested he had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with charm and determination. But what made Daniel's stomach drop wasn't the attractiveness of the person in the photo, it was the fact that he recognized him immediately. This wasn't just any handsome stranger. This was Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell, heir to one of the largest financial empires in the country, whose face had been plastered across business magazines and society pages for the past several years as he prepared to take over his family's investment firm. Daniel had seen Sebastian's photo dozens of times in news articles about young entrepreneurs in wealthy families. Sebastian was famous not just for his family's money, but for his own accomplishments. He had graduated from an Ivy League university with honors, started his own successful tech company while still in college, and was frequently featured in lists of the most eligible bachelors under 30. His social media presence was carefully curated to show a lifestyle of luxury travel, exclusive events, and connections with other wealthy and powerful people. More importantly, Daniel knew enough about Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell to know that nothing about him matched the person Alexander had described himself to be. Sebastian was known for his confidence and ambition, not the self-doubt and identity struggles that Alexander had shared. Sebastian's family relationships appeared to be supportive and collaborative based on public appearances, not the source of pressure and conflict that Alexander had described. And Sebastian was very publicly involved in a long-term relationship with a prominent socialite named Victoria Ashworth, whose own Instagram account featured frequent photos of them together at charity galas and vacation destinations. Daniel stared at the photo for several minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His first instinct was to assume that this was some kind of mistake, that Alexander had accidentally sent the wrong image, or that there was some explanation that would make everything make sense. But as he thought about it more carefully, he realized that this couldn't be an accident. The photo was clearly intended as a personal sharing moment, and Alexander had taken several days to select it specifically for this purpose. The more Daniel analyzed the situation, the more disturbing it became. If Alexander was really Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell, then everything he had shared about his life circumstances had been lies. Rich heirs to financial empires didn't struggle with money or feel trapped by limited options. They didn't spend their evenings playing online games with college students and discussing literary themes about social class inequality. And they certainly didn't develop romantic relationships with people they met in gaming forums. But if Alexander wasn't really Sebastian, then he was using someone else's photo to deceive Daniel about his appearance, which meant that everything about their relationship was built on lies, including the physical attraction component that they had just begun exploring. Daniel felt sick as he considered the possibility that someone had been manipulating him for months, using fake photos and a carefully constructed persona to gain his trust and affection. Daniel's hands shook as he tried to figure out how to respond to Alexander's message. He needed more information before he could determine what was actually happening, but he also didn't want to reveal his suspicions if there was some innocent explanation that he hadn't considered. He decided to craft a response that would test whether Alexander was really the person in the photo without immediately accusing him of deception. "Thank you for sharing your photo with me,"
You're even more handsome than I imagined, and I can definitely see the intelligence and kindness in your expression that I've come to associate with your personality. I have to admit, you look familiar somehow. Have you ever been featured in any publications or media coverage? You have the kind of face that would be memorable in professional contexts. The response came more quickly than usual, which Daniel noted as potentially significant. If Alexander was really Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell, he would presumably be busy with business responsibilities and might not be able to respond to messages immediately. But if Alexander was someone else using Sebastian's photo, he might be more readily available to maintain the deception. I'm glad you like the photo, and I'm relieved that you think it captures my personality accurately. As for looking familiar, my family does have some business connections that sometimes result in professional photography, so it's possible you've seen my photo in some business context. I tend to keep a low profile personally, but sometimes family obligations require public appearances that I can't avoid. I hope that doesn't change how you feel about me, knowing that I come from a background that includes some public visibility. Daniel read the response several times, noting that it was carefully worded to acknowledge the possibility of public recognition without providing any specific details that could be verified. If Alexander was really Sebastian, this would be a reasonable explanation for why Daniel recognized him. But it could equally well be the response of someone who had anticipated that using a famous person's photo might lead to recognition and had prepared a plausible cover story. Daniel decided to push a little further, asking questions that would require specific knowledge if Alexander was really the person in the photo. I understand about family business obligations, and it doesn't change how I feel about you at all. I'm actually impressed that you've managed to stay so grounded despite having access to opportunities that most people could only dream of. Can I ask what specific area of business your family is involved in? And have you found ways to pursue your own interests despite the family expectations you've mentioned? This time the response took much longer, and when it finally came, Daniel noticed that the writing style seemed slightly different from Alexander's usual communication patterns. The language was less sophisticated, and the insights were more superficial than the thoughtful analysis that had originally attracted Daniel to Alexander's personality. Our family business is primarily in finance and investments, helping other families and institutions manage their wealth and plan for the future. It's interesting work, but sometimes I feel like I'm just following a path that was designed before I was born, rather than choosing my own direction. I've been trying to explore other interests like technology and literature, but it's challenging to find time when there are so many family responsibilities that require attention. Daniel felt his suspicions growing stronger. The response was generic enough to apply to any wealthy family, and it didn't demonstrate the kind of specific knowledge that someone actually involved in high-level finance would possess. More importantly, the emotional tone was different from the nuanced self-reflection that had characterized Alexander's previous discussions about his family's situation. Daniel spent the rest of the evening researching everything he could find about Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell online. What he discovered made it even more unlikely that Sebastian was the person he had been talking to for months. Sebastian's public appearances and social media posts showed him to be consistently busy with business activities, social obligations, and his relationship with Victoria. His communication style in interviews and public statements was confident and polished, very different from the vulnerable and uncertain tone that Alexander had used when discussing personal struggles. More significantly, Daniel found several recent articles and social media posts that showed Sebastian's activities during times when Alexander had been having long conversations with Daniel. There were photos of Sebastian at business conferences, charity events, and romantic dinners with Victoria that had been posted at the exact times when Alexander had been online gaming and sharing intimate thoughts about loneliness and identity confusion. By the time Daniel went to bed that night, he was convinced that someone was using Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell's photo to deceive him, but he still didn't know who was really behind the Alexander persona or why they had chosen to target him specifically. The relationship had felt so genuine and meaningful that it was difficult to believe that someone could fake that level of emotional connection and intellectual compatibility. Daniel decided that he needed to find a way to uncover the truth without destroying the possibility that there was some innocent explanation he hadn't considered. He would continue the relationship while gathering more information, testing Alexander's claims and looking for inconsistencies that would reveal the deception. If Alexander was really lying about his identity, Daniel was determined to find out who he really was and why he had chosen to manipulate him in such an elaborate way. Chapter 3. Gathering Evidence. Daniel approached the next phase of his investigation with the methodical mindset he usually reserved for his literature research projects. He created a document where he could track inconsistencies in Alexander's stories, noting dates and times when Alexander's claimed activities conflicted with Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell's documented public appearances. He also began paying closer attention to Alexander's communication patterns, looking for clues about his real identity and motivations. The first major inconsistency came up when Alexander mentioned attending a family business meeting that had kept him busy for most of a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel knew from his research that Sebastian had been photographed at a charity golf tournament that same Tuesday, several hundred miles away from where Alexander claimed to be. When Daniel casually asked about the golf tournament, wondering if Alexander ever attended such events, Alexander claimed that he avoided golf because he found it boring and elitist. This was particularly telling because Sebastian was known to be an accomplished golfer who had won several amateur tournaments. It seemed unlikely that someone would lie about disliking an activity they were actually skilled at, unless they were trying to distance themselves from facts that could be easily verified through public records. Daniel also began testing Alexander's knowledge about topics that Sebastian would presumably be familiar with. When Daniel brought up recent developments in the investment industry, Alexander's responses were vague and showed no deeper understanding than what someone could gain from reading basic financial news. When Daniel mentioned specific companies that Sebastian's family firm had recently worked with, Alexander claimed not to be familiar with those particular deals. Most significantly, Daniel discovered that Alexander's communication schedule didn't match the patterns that would be expected from someone with Sebastian's lifestyle and responsibilities. Alexander was consistently available for long conversations during times when Sebastian would presumably be busy with business obligations. Alexander also seemed to have unlimited free time for gaming and casual chat, which didn't align with the demanding schedule that someone preparing to take over a major financial empire would likely maintain. Daniel decided to set up a more direct test. He told Alexander that he had been thinking about their relationship and felt ready to take the next step toward meeting in person. He suggested that they arrange a video call first, so they could see each other in real time and have a more immediate conversation than their usual text-based communication allowed. Alexander's response revealed more about his true situation than perhaps he intended. "I would love to video chat with you, but my current living situation makes that complicated. I'm staying in a temporary arrangement where I don't have much privacy, and I'd rather wait until I can give you my full attention without worrying about interruptions or other people overhearing our conversation. I know it seems like I'm making excuses, but I really want our first real-time conversation to be special and intimate rather than rushed or awkward." Daniel noted that this was the first time Alexander had mentioned anything about temporary living arrangements. In all their previous conversations about his family situation, Alexander had implied that he was living in his own space, dealing with family pressure but maintaining some level of independence and privacy. The sudden introduction of a living situation that would prevent video calling seemed convenient and potentially fabricated. Daniel also realized that someone using Sebastian's photo would have obvious reasons to avoid video calling since they couldn't maintain the deception if Daniel could see them in real time. This response strengthened Daniel's suspicion that Alexander was not the person in the photo he had shared. To gather more evidence, Daniel began asking questions that would require specific knowledge about Sebastian's background and experiences. He mentioned that he had always been curious about what it was like to attend elite private schools, wondering if Alexander could share any insights about that environment. Alexander's response was generic and didn't include the kind of specific details that someone who had actually attended such schools would likely remember. When Daniel asked about international travel experiences, hoping to compare Alexander's stories with Sebastian's documented trips to various countries, Alexander claimed that his family obligations had actually limited his opportunities for personal travel. This directly contradicted Sebastian's well-documented history of international business trips and luxury vacations that were frequently featured in his social media posts. Daniel also tested Alexander's knowledge about current events in the social circles that Sebastian would presumably be part of. When Daniel mentioned news about other wealthy families or business leaders that Sebastian would likely know personally, Alexander either claimed not to be familiar with them or provided responses that suggested only superficial knowledge gained from public news sources. As Daniel accumulated more evidence of the deception, he found himself feeling increasingly hurt and angry. The person behind the Alexander persona had invested months in gaining Daniel's trust and affection, learning his vulnerabilities and insecurities, and encouraging him to share his most private thoughts and feelings. This wasn't just a simple case of someone lying about their appearance on a dating app. This was an elaborate psychological manipulation that had targeted Daniel specifically and personally. Daniel began to wonder whether this was some kind of cruel joke, or if there were more serious motives behind the deception. Had someone been gathering information about him for some purpose he couldn't imagine? Was this part of some larger scheme involving identity theft or financial fraud? Or was it simply the work of someone who enjoyed manipulating others for entertainment? The most disturbing possibility was that the deception was being carried out by someone Daniel knew in his real life. The Alexander persona had demonstrated knowledge about Daniel's personality, interests, and communication style that suggested careful observation and analysis. Someone would need to know Daniel quite well to create a fake personality that appealed to him so specifically and effectively. Daniel considered the people in his life who would have the opportunity to observe him closely enough to construct such a targeted deception. His roommates had certainly heard enough of his complaints about dating and relationships to understand what kind of person he was looking for. His classmates in literature courses had witnessed his intellectual interests and analytical approach to complex texts. His coworkers at the campus bookstore had observed his interactions with customers and his reactions to various social situations. Any of these people could potentially have enough information about Daniel to create a fake online personality designed to appeal to him. But Daniel couldn't imagine why any of them would invest so much time and effort in such an elaborate deception, or what they would hope to gain from manipulating him in this way.
The department's efficiency must be maintained at all costs. Each case file, every piece of evidence, serves as a foundation for justice in Fontaine. I shall personally ensure that proper protocols are followed, without exception. Daniel also considered the possibility that this was some kind of social experiment or research project. Perhaps someone was studying online relationship formation or the psychology of digital deception, and Daniel had unknowingly become a test subject. This would explain the sophisticated nature of the manipulation and the sustained effort required to maintain it over several months. But regardless of the motive, Daniel felt violated and betrayed by the discovery that his relationship with Alexander was built on lies. He had shared intimate details about his fears, insecurities, and dreams with someone who was deceiving him about their most basic identity. The emotional connection that had felt so genuine and meaningful was revealed to be a one-sided illusion. Daniel knew that he needed to confront Alexander about the deception, but he wanted to gather enough evidence to make denial impossible. He was also curious to discover who was really behind the elaborate fraud and what their ultimate goal had been. He decided to set up one final test that would force Alexander to either reveal the truth or expose himself through an obvious lie. Chapter 4: The Final Test. Daniel spent considerable time planning his final confrontation with Alexander, wanting to create a situation that would make continued deception impossible, while also potentially revealing the identity of the person behind the fraud. He decided to approach this as he would any complex problem, systematically, with multiple layers of verification, and with backup plans in case his primary strategy didn't work. His first step was to create a scenario that would require Alexander to provide specific, verifiable information about Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell's life and activities. Daniel crafted a message explaining that he had been thinking about their relationship and felt ready to move toward meeting in person, but first he wanted to understand Alexander's background better so he could be sensitive to any family pressures or social complications that might affect their relationship. I've been thinking about what you've shared regarding your family's business connections and the public aspects of your background. I want to make sure I understand your situation fully so I can be supportive as we move toward meeting in person. Could you tell me more specifically about your family's company and your role in it? I'd also like to understand better what kind of public recognition you mentioned so I can be prepared for any complications that might arise if we're seen together publicly. Alexander's response came several hours later, and Daniel immediately noticed that it avoided providing any specific information that could be verified. Instead, it offered vague generalizations and deflected toward discussing Daniel's concerns rather than addressing the actual questions. I appreciate that you want to understand my background better, and it means a lot that you're thinking about how to be supportive of my situation. The truth is, I've been somewhat vague about these details because I'm still figuring out how much I want my family obligations to influence this relationship. I care about you so much that I want to protect what we have from outside pressures that could complicate things. Would it be okay if we focused on our personal connection for now, and I share more specific details about my family situation once we've had a chance to meet and talk in person? Daniel recognized this as a classic deflection tactic, designed to avoid providing information while making the person asking questions feel guilty for pushing too hard. Someone who was genuinely Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell would likely be comfortable discussing basic facts about their family business, especially after months of building trust with someone they claimed to care about. Daniel's second test was more direct. He told Alexander that he had been doing some casual research about investment firms and wealth management, hoping to better understand Alexander's world, and had come across some information about the Montgomery Blackwell Financial Group. He wondered if this was Alexander's family company, and if so, whether Alexander could share any insights about what it was like growing up in that environment. This message was designed to force Alexander to either admit that he was not really Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell, or to claim a connection to the Montgomery Blackwell family that Daniel could easily verify as false. If Alexander was really Sebastian, he would presumably be comfortable acknowledging his family's company and discussing his experiences with it. If Alexander was using Sebastian's photo fraudulently, he would either have to lie about being connected to a famous family or find another way to avoid the question. Alexander's response confirmed Daniel's suspicions about the deception, but also revealed something unexpected about the person behind it. I'm not comfortable discussing specific companies or family names in our online conversations, especially since I know how easy it is for private communications to become public. I hope you can understand that I need to be careful about protecting my family's privacy and business interests. Can we please talk about something else? I'm much more interested in learning about your day and hearing about your upcoming exams than discussing business matters that honestly stress me out and make me feel disconnected from the parts of life that actually matter to me. Daniel noted several significant things about this response. First, Alexander was refusing to confirm or deny any connection to the Montgomery Blackwell family, which suggested he knew that any specific claim could be easily disproven. Second, the emotional tone of the response seemed genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply evasive, which made Daniel wonder if the person behind the deception was feeling guilty about the fraud they were perpetrating. Most importantly, the response included specific details about Daniel's life that suggested the person behind Alexander had access to information about Daniel's current activities. The reference to upcoming exams was particularly significant because Daniel had only mentioned his exam schedule to a few people in his immediate social circle. This confirmed Daniel's suspicion that Alexander was someone who knew him personally in his offline life. The deception wasn't being carried out by a random internet stranger, but by someone who had ongoing access to information about Daniel's daily activities and emotional state. This made the betrayal feel even more personal and disturbing. Daniel decided to implement his final test, which was designed to force the person behind Alexander to reveal their true identity. He sent a message explaining that he had been thinking about their relationship and realized that he needed to meet Alexander in person before their emotional connection became any deeper. He proposed a specific meeting location and time, giving Alexander only 24 hours' notice to make it impossible to create elaborate excuses about scheduling conflicts. Alexander, I've been thinking about what you said regarding protecting our relationship from outside pressures, and I realize that uncertainty about who you really are is actually creating more stress for me than knowing the truth would. I need to meet you in person this weekend. I'll be at the Central Coffee Shop on campus Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. It's a public place where we can talk safely, and if you're really the person you've claimed to be, there shouldn't be any reason you can't meet me there. If you don't show up, I'll have to assume that our entire relationship has been built on lies, and I won't be able to continue this connection. Daniel knew that this ultimatum would force the person behind Alexander to either reveal themselves or abandon the deception entirely. If Alexander was really Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell, he would presumably be able to arrange to meet Daniel, even if it required some planning around his other obligations. If Alexander was someone else entirely, they would either have to confess the truth or disappear from Daniel's life to avoid being exposed. The response came within an hour, and it confirmed everything Daniel had suspected while also breaking his heart. Daniel, I owe you complete honesty, and I can't keep lying to you any longer. You're right that our relationship has been built on deception, but not in the way you might think. I am not the person in the photo I sent you. I have been using someone else's picture because I was afraid that you wouldn't be interested in me if you knew what I really looked like and what my actual life circumstances are. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone, but I know that what I've done is unforgivable. I don't deserve to meet you in person, and I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I'm sorry for hurting you, and I hope you can find someone who will give you the honesty and respect that you deserve. Daniel stared at this message for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and anger. He had been right about the deception, but knowing the truth didn't make the betrayal any easier to process. Someone had spent months gaining his trust, learning his vulnerabilities, and allowing him to develop genuine feelings, all while lying about their most basic identity. But the confession also raised new questions. Who was the real person behind Alexander? Why had they chosen to target Daniel specifically? And what did they hope to gain from such an elaborate deception? Daniel realized that even with Alexander's partial confession, he still didn't know the most important facts about what had happened to him. Daniel decided that he deserved to know the complete truth about who had manipulated him and why. He would go to the coffee shop meeting as planned, hoping that the person behind Alexander would have the courage to face him in person and provide the answers he needed to understand what had been done to him. Chapter 5, The Truth Revealed. Saturday afternoon arrived, gray and drizzly, matching Daniel's mood as he walked across campus toward the Central Coffee Shop. He had spent the previous evening alternating between hoping that Alexander would show up to explain himself and dreading the possibility of finally learning the truth about who had been deceiving him for months. Part of him wanted to skip the meeting entirely, to simply block Alexander's number and try to move on without ever knowing the real story behind the elaborate fraud. But Daniel knew that he needed closure, and that meant getting answers to the questions that had been consuming him since he discovered the deception. He arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where he could see anyone approaching the building. He ordered a coffee he didn't really want, and tried to prepare himself for whatever revelation was about to unfold. At exactly 2 o'clock, Daniel saw a familiar figure approaching the coffee shop entrance, and his heart sank as he realized that his worst suspicions were being confirmed. Marcus Chen, his study partner from contemporary literature class, paused outside the door for a moment before taking a deep breath and entering the cafe. Marcus looked around nervously until he spotted Daniel, then approached his table with an expression that mixed guilt, shame, and desperate hope. Daniel felt a wave of betrayal that was somehow worse than anything he had experienced when he first discovered the photo deception. Marcus was someone he had considered a friend, someone he studied with twice a week, someone who had listened to him complain about his dating struggles and offered sympathetic advice about the challenges of finding genuine connection in college. The idea that Marcus had been secretly orchestrating those dating struggles while pretending to support him felt like a particularly cruel violation of trust. Marcus sat down across from Daniel without being invited, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on the table. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Daniel stared at Marcus, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the person who had been manipulating him for months. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the table, apparently unable to meet Daniel's gaze. Finally, Marcus broke the silence with a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I know you hate me, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that everything I felt was real, even if everything I told you was a lie." Daniel felt his anger crystallizing into something cold and sharp. "Everything you felt was real? You spent months lying to me about who you were, using a fake photo, creating an entire fictional identity. How exactly was any of that real?" Marcus looked up for the first time since sitting down, and Daniel could see tears forming in his eyes. "The conversations were real. The way I felt when you shared your thoughts and fears with me was real. The connection we developed was real, even if the foundation was built on lies. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to understand that I wasn't just playing games with your emotions." "Then why did you do it?" Daniel asked, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "Why create this elaborate fiction? Why use someone else's photo? Why target me specifically?" Marcus took a shaky breath before responding. "Because I've been in love with you for almost 2 years, and I knew you would never see me as anything more than a study partner if I approached you as myself." Daniel felt like he had been physically struck. "What are you talking about? We've been friends since sophomore year. If you had feelings for me, why didn't you just tell me directly?" "Because I'm not the kind of person you're attracted to," Marcus said, his voice becoming steadier as he apparently decided to commit fully to honesty. "I've watched you for 2 years, Daniel. I've seen the guys you notice, the ones you talk about, the ones you go on dates with. They're all confident, outgoing, conventionally attractive. They're nothing like me." Daniel stared at Marcus, trying to process this revelation. It was true that Daniel had never considered Marcus as a potential romantic partner, but that was more because he had never thought of Marcus in that context than because he found him unattractive or incompatible. Marcus was quiet and studious, but he was also intelligent, kind, and genuinely interesting to talk with. Under different circumstances, Daniel might well have been open to exploring a romantic connection with him. "So you decided to create a fake identity instead of just talking to me like a normal person?" Daniel asked. "You thought lying to me for months was a better approach than simply asking me on a date?" Marcus shook his head. "It wasn't planned like that. It started as just a way to have deeper conversations with you, without the awkwardness of our classroom dynamic. I created the gaming account because I wanted to talk with you about books and ideas without you feeling like it was connected to our academic responsibilities." "But you used someone else's photo," Daniel pointed out. "That wasn't just about having conversations. That was deliberate deception about your identity." Marcus's face reddened with shame. "You asked for a photo, and I panicked. I knew that if I sent you my real picture, you would either recognize me and feel weird about our existing friendship, or you wouldn't recognize me and would lose interest once you saw what I actually look like. I found that photo of Sebastian Montgomery Blackwell and convinced myself that I was just buying time until I could figure out how to transition from online connection to real-life relationship." Daniel felt his anger mixing with sadness as he began to understand the full scope of what had happened. "Marcus, you spent months allowing me to develop feelings for someone who doesn't exist. You let me share my most intimate thoughts and fears with a fictional character. You manipulated me into caring about you by pretending to be someone else entirely." "I know," Marcus said, tears now flowing freely down his face. "But Daniel, the person you fell for wasn't completely fictional. Those were my thoughts, my ideas, my feelings. The only things I lied about were my appearance and my background circumstances." "Those aren't small things, Marcus," Daniel replied. "Identity isn't just about personality and ideas. It's about the complete picture of who someone is, including their appearance, their background, their real-life circumstances. You created a fantasy version of yourself and let me fall in love with that fantasy instead of giving me the opportunity to know and care about the real you." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the validity of Daniel's anger. "You're absolutely right, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that the emotional connection was genuine, even if everything else was built on lies.